And irrespective of whether you have heard me say this before or not, forgive me if you have already heard me say this. I would think of the Prime Minister's speech on Independence Day talking about demographic dividend as an acknowledgement that things are not quite what we would have wanted them to be. And it's about, see, there's one talk about jobs, availability of jobs and so on and so forth. But what I'm also aware of, and this is because about a month ago I had somebody approached me. This person had read something that I had written on higher education in India, something about demographic dividend, not exactly the same thing. This was the CEO, owner, founder of a very large company based out of Boston, with branches in 5 different countries, including India, Mexico, and so on. One of the things we talked about for an hour, and he said, "Look, how can this be fixed?" He said, "Look, I'm looking to hire people, but they are either too expensive." So an IIT graduate is very expensive for computer science, for the better performing ones. And he says, the salary I have to, and they're expensive because there are not enough of them. So he said, I can get some of these people, but then I realized that I would be spending almost as much as I do in the States. The second part is where he said that, look, then we go for second stream people, and there is no really second stream. You can't get, you get people whom you have to retrain for at least a year. And he says that requires considerable time. It requires considerable expenses. So, and this is just one sector. It's fair to assume that this is not, or I'm assuming that this is not true for all kinds of jobs and everything. But looking at the kinds of colleges and universities in terms of their quality and the fact that they have deteriorated over a period of time because of very low government funding on that. The share of the private sector has increased and they're more expensive without necessarily providing quality. So that basically also tells us that the market will not work by itself. You can have a very flourishing private sector, but what flourishing basically means is numbers and numbers of institutions and numbers of students registered at these institutions and the money that the owners make out of it. It doesn't mean that students who go to these institutions will be found suitable for the kinds of jobs that are available. And that basically points to a double conundrum. One, that we might not have enough jobs. We do not have enough jobs. Second, for the jobs that are available, we do not have people who can fit into those jobs at salaries, for some kinds of jobs at least, at salaries that are fairly competitive. Now, the whole idea that there is a demographic dividend is probably based on that old notion of India as an agricultural society where you need X number of people to carry something or to do something, right? Where it's not about your brain but number of hands. But the moment you start thinking of a large country like India in terms of number of able-bodied men and women, there is a problem because we have long transitioned to a more urban, services-oriented and manufacturing-oriented economy. We no longer need just hands. We need people who have that basic education or more specialized kind of education. Now, things are not so good, particularly good, in that sector. So, and we have had a couple of speakers on that. Maheshwar Perry was here a couple of years ago talking about the sheer numbers of people who are graduating and how the higher education sector is yet to reorient, or the school sector has yet to provide that kind of a background for these people, for these young people to fit into the modern economy. So the demographic dividend is something which people have been talking about for the last 10 years without actually being able to do or actually doing something about it. And thank God that the Prime Minister has brought it up, because it says, I think it is something, a crisis, real crisis staring us in the face. A second point I wanted to actually point out is political will is a very useful expression at times, But political will comes out of fear of punishment, I think. So if there is no fear of punishment, how do you expect politicians to have a political will? Right? The reason why we have elections, the reason why democracy is about uncertainty of outcomes, is because so that political will can be manufactured. Otherwise, if election outcomes are predetermined, then what need do I have to do anything for you if I'm going to be in this chair anyway, right? I mean, that's how it goes. So political will is very, very interesting. It's very commonly used by political scientists, by journalists, and so on. But it is a very strong, link to losing and winning. And that's how it should be, I think. That's how it can be. We can think all we want about, this ideal kind of prime minister or president who can do no wrong and who will fix everything. It doesn't happen. It hasn't happened anywhere in the world. It's not going to happen here. So you have to have a scenario where the person in the chair can be removed from that chair. Okay.
Sir, my name is Suresh Kamath. I wanted to know, for the last 10, 15 years, more corruption, more unemployment, and more fake certificates and fake degrees are coming up. What the government will do about all these questions? Because there is no solution for this, and day by day there is a zero tolerance, but these things are going on for the last 10 years at a large scale. And every day papers in the newspapers, it is advertised that more corruption is going on, and even the ministers are going to bars. When Amit Shah was in bar, Chidambaram was the Home Minister. Now Amit Shah is the Chief Minister, Home Minister. Chidambaram is in the bar. What do you want to say about it?
I don't know what to say, except for the fact that I don't think this has been happening only for 10 years. It's been happening for much longer than that, number one. Number two, it has happened for 10 years, and yet a government comes back to office with a larger mandate, means that the average voter does not want to punish the sitting government for doing something like this. And if the average voter does not want to, if the large majority of voters in the country do not want to punish the government for being corrupt, if, like how you say, they are corrupt, then why should it change? What is the pressure on the government to change? Yes.
Because I see young students nowadays, they are having bad vices like drinking, dangerous, ganja, and all that, and they are simply loitering here and there, and they are not having that is called they don't have that India is our country, or we love India. Indians are my brothers and sisters. Though we used to say Indians are my brothers and sisters, now there is all raping, murders, all those things, and the young children don't know the meaning of humanity and concern for others and tolerance, character, all these things, good values. They are lacking all these values. I think the modern generation or the teachers should do their best to teach them good values in the schools, because in the schools, if they are given good values, they will come up as good citizens. Because nowadays, the teachers should not beat them. They should not make their eyes. They should not touch them. This is how they will they will follow the right values if they are not taught properly in this year. This is my...
I agree, there is a deterioration of the value system in society, and perhaps the education system is not churning out good citizens. Character building is not good. And what all of this points to is the need for basic reform in education, but also in families. Why are families not able to give to children values like they did even 20 years ago? I think India is a society in churn. There's a lot of migration that is happening. There is a lot of movement from rural to urban that is happening. And our institutions do not have the capacity to handle the kind of churn that is happening. We do have a large proportion of young population, but they do not have vocational skills like you explained, or the educational training for them to become gainfully employed. We also do not have enough opportunities to engage them in and train them on the job. We do not have a value system that we are giving, like you're describing. What is driving youngsters is a sense of aspiration and a future they're looking at, without a strategy or a path towards that goal. And it's only a matter of time when this realization will come that that aspiration is not within reach. And I dread to think what will happen then. And therefore, I don't think there can be a shortcut to what you're saying. We have to invest in our institutions and build our institutions, the institution of family, the institution of the education system, etc., etc.
A bit of a specific question, since we're talking about different kinds of institutions here. One of the things that NDA does is blow up the Planning Commission and replace it with Niti Aayog. Now, my sense as a student of politics is that institutions, the problem with old institutions is that they do things in a particular way and cannot get out of that framework. So you have bureaucrats within an institution with vested interests, with all their networks, and things work in very predictable ways. Now, if those predictable ways of doing things are not yielding the kind of outcomes you need to get rid or reform those institutions. Now, when one says reform, there are two ways of doing it. One is bring in new people, have new rules and regulations in place, and so on. Or you simply do away with the pre-existing institution, which is the Planning Commission, and have a new institution in its place. Now, the problem is that even when you create a new institution, it's not as if just by virtue of its newness alone, having a new name is going to necessarily do anything for the economy, or in terms of expert advice that you get from that institution. What do you think ails Niti Aayog? Because all it seems to be doing is saying good things about what is going on. And there are good things going on. I mean, in the sense that it is not the Information and Broadcasting Ministry or department, right? I mean, when we talk about demographic dividend, for example, the concerns are very real and probably much more immediate than what is made out to be. We are really still talking about how we can benefit, whereas half the country has already moved out of it. I mean, there's an India Spent story today or even earlier, which is at least the southern states are already out of that phase. It's only the north which is left, which is more populated, of course, and therefore in some ways more significant. But has Niti Aayog been doing something substantial?
You're right that for the longest time the Niti Aayog has behaved like the official spokesperson for the government in terms of countering narratives that are not flattering for the government, especially on the economic policy side, except last night. The Niti Aayog's Vice Chairman, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, an economist, has given a statement saying that the Indian economy is going through a financial crisis that India has never seen in 70 years. And it's all doom, and we don't know what to do. And I don't know what led him to make such statement because I think it doesn't help. It just creates panic. So the Niti Aayog seems to have swung from saying all is well, and anybody who says things need to be corrected are professional pessimists. I think that's the term that was used. To saying that nothing is working and everything has crashed. I don't think either of the two are fully accurate. So I think the problem so definitely Planning Commission had a problem, and the first person who recommended Planning Commission to be wound up is actually Dr. Manmohan Singh. And he did it when he was the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, and he left saying that the Planning Commission does not do, we no longer need an institution like the Planning Commission. And after that, even when he was Prime Minister, he wrote many times to the Deputy Chairman Montek Singh Ahluwalia, even outlining what all changes needed to be carried out. And the Planning Commission could not reform itself. And in fact, in my book, I have a huge section on all of this, on Niti Aayog, on the transition from Planning Commission to Niti Aayog, and where the last meeting of the full Planning Commission before election results are announced, once again, Dr. Manmohan Singh meets the members and says exactly all of this. And Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, in fact, it's so pinched that he writes, I think if I'm not wrong, a 21-page letter, saying, yes, all this needs to be done. And that is the letter actually that forms the basis of the Niti Aayog. So yes, definitely Planning Commission needed to go. But it's not just the name Planning Commission. The mindset that Planning Commission represented needed to go. And the main thing that the Planning Commission did, which is the centrally sponsored schemes, and the giving of the money from the center to the states and various ministries, what needs to be done with that, a decision had to be taken. Niti Aayog was formed. Its composition is different from that of Planning Commission. It does not allocate money like the Planning Commission used to states or ministries, but the centrally sponsored schemes remain. The development policies have not changed. They have been passed on from Planning Commission to this government, even though Niti Aayog doesn't do it, other agencies do it, but the problem remains. The Niti Aayog does not deliver because the Niti Aayog has not been told what it has to deliver.
It's sort of a partisan think tank, right?
It is a sort of a partisan think tank, and if I'd love to read out a quote to you from the person who set up the Niti Aayog. Where this person says that when the Prime Minister called this official for a meeting to discuss what the institution that will replace Planning Commission should be, what is the mandate, how should we design this new institution, it's there, I'm not able to find it. The mandate from the Prime Minister was simply that it should not be Planning Commission. He just knows that he doesn't want a Planning Commission, and there is a very specific reason for that. It is the way the Planning Commission always treated him when he was Gujarat Chief Minister. He was not treated well, and therefore he doesn't want the Planning Commission. He thinks it's useless. He's been able to grow the Gujarat state, without any help from the Commission, and therefore it's not needed. But what needs to replace it, he does not give any mandate on that. And because it's not clear what you want Niti Aayog to do, it is not designed with any clarity on what it needs to do. And what it does today, therefore, is what people in key positions in Niti Aayog assume their job is. And the easiest thing to assume is that you have to defend the government, you have to exaggerate the positives, and you have to challenge the negatives. And occasionally, write some analysis, send some policy inputs when you're asked for them. But I don't think Niti Aayog is able to influence any policy making, because the formal structure of policy making is such that a ministry makes a note, it sends it to the cabinet approves
So it basically responds to policy in a positive way.
Responds to policy in a positive way, and sometimes it makes some noises which are not binding on ministries.
Okay. Last two questions.
Madam, did not you see that increasing population of India is eating economy of our country? Just I want your comment.
Sorry, I'm not, I didn't get the question.
Increasing population of India today is eating the economy of India, our country. That is what I want.
Are you asking if increase and a bigger population is good for the economy?
No. Today's increasing population of India, what the comment said by the Prime Minister, population has to be controlled, all this. That population is adversely impacting the economy of India, and one day it will doom the country. What is your comment about this? That's
I thought we discussed that, no, already?
You not understood my question, madam?
No, I'm saying, I think we already addressed that question quite a bit, actually.
I'll answer that a little later in a different way.
No, actually, this is a very it's a real vital question today we are facing. After all discussion, everything lies in that only, because today India is going to supersede China in population. That is what today's our politicians are needed to halt the population so that we can stabilize the economy. That's what I want to comment, and your comments are required on this.
I don't think the population is a limiting factor on the economy. On the contrary, the population should ideally be, India is a labor abundant country. That is India's comparative advantage in the rest of the world. Whether that comparative advantage is realized, because at the moment it's potential, whether that potential is realized into actual benefit or not depends on policies. If you take the right policies, the population is your comparative advantage. It is what makes you competitive relative to other countries. But if you do not pursue the right policies, then that comparative advantage turns into a nightmare. So the choice is in our hands.
See, one of the responses to the Prime Minister expressing his concern about population growth, etc., was that India's population growth has already slowed down considerably. The southern states in particular, the population growth is okay, and yeah, and the states in the north are getting there. We might think India is going to be overrun by North Indians or otherwise, but population growth even in UP, Bihar, etc. has slowed down already. Country. The other thing is,
I think the point that he's making is that we are not sure why the Prime Minister is saying it is a concern, because population growth has been slowing down for the country.
That's one, and second, population is an advantage. When he talks about the demographic dividend, that population is an advantage. The reason why India is a competitive economy is also because of the size of its labor force. Now the problem is that labor force is not skilled enough to contribute more to the economy. So that is why it is becoming a burden. The reason why we imagined it would be a source of a huge demographic dividend is because we assumed that हाथ से काम कर सकते हैं वो काफ़ी है. But the problem is in 21st century, दिमाग से काम करने की ज़रूरत है, and that is something where we have fallen behind. So that's why the Prime Minister's message sends out very mixed message. Whether population is a concern, should be a concern, or should we celebrate it because it can be a.
I disagree with you. If you go to the local Times of India or some papers, they said Indian population will supersede in 2030.
Yeah.
Just go it. But your comment seems to be very adverse and worse in other ways. But if you think it's the population which is concerning.
No, population growth is something people have been concerned about. since the 19th century at least.
Our population is eating our GDP.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tanya Fernandez. Thank you for being here, Puja. Speaking of institutions and questionable institutions, I have a question surrounding the skepticism of key economic indicators that are being released by the government. And my question is threefold. What do you see as the future of this as a journalist? Secondly, as a journalist, how do you comb through this to make sure that you provide us accurate data? And thirdly, as consumers of this data, what should we be looking for as red flags, and how should we be reading it more effectively?
So I share your concern with the official statistical apparatus findings, which are completely contrary to common sense of late. But as somebody who has studied economics and has studied statistics, especially national income accounts, I'm assuming you're talking about GDP growth rates, the huge controversy, including what the former chief economic advisor Arvind Subramanian has said about it. And there is a slight mention of it also in my book. So first of all, what we need to understand is that GDP estimation is not an exact, is not an exercise in exact estimation anywhere in the world. GDP is not, something you can measure in kgs by putting into a weighing scale, right? You estimate it because it is not measurable. So therefore, that has a lot of conceptual challenges, a lot of challenges of data collection, a lot of challenges of bringing that data together and handling it, and it's an extremely complex exercise. GDP estimation involves thousands of surveys, separately estimating industries, what they call as, there are these classifications that go into thousands, and it's very difficult to fudge this exercise. At the same time, however, conceptually, you have to do a whole lot of processes on this data when you refine it. And you have to exercise choice. For instance, whether to use one sort of a deflator or a second sort of a deflator. And a whole lot of judgments need to be exercised. In exercising of those judgments, there is scope at a very senior level for GDP estimates, I wouldn't say to be fudged, but to be presented in a certain way. Now, the controversy, so this is true at all times. The recent peaking of controversy around GDP estimates has two sides to it. One is that there are tremendous challenges in estimating India's GDP because we have a very large informal sector economy. So when I say informal sector economy, I'm talking about the tailor who sits, on the road and stitches clothes which majority of Indians wear. Majority of Indians do not buy clothes on Flipkart or whatever, If you were to go to a store, a mall, and buy clothes, it's very easy to capture that in GDP. But majority of Indians live their lives in a way where the GDP coming out of that cannot be captured in the official estimates. And therefore, you have to do a lot of assumption, survey, etc., etc. And the minute you begin to do that, and you're dealing with chota companies that don't keep books, that tailor does not keep books, you're getting into a space where you don't even know if you're off the mark, how off the mark you are. So that is the challenge, especially in the services sector. I'd add here that the previous the GDP for the years in which the previous government was in office was reduced quite a bit. I don't think average people understand, even commentators don't understand why that was done. You see, when the largest part of India's economy is the services sector, and that's the most difficult to estimate because most of it is informal. So what they do is, they do a survey of some companies where they go and ask them, how many employees do you have and what is the productivity of each employee? Then they do surveys to find out the employment numbers for the entire sector, and there's an extrapolation involved. And they multiply the per employee productivity that they have obtained through surveys for productivity and multiply it by the estimate of the number of people they think who are gaining employment. The problem here is that employment surveys are done only once every 5 years. So but you need GDP numbers every quarter. So what they do in the intervening period is that they assume that employment may have grown by a certain factor, and they keep increasing that employment factor, and they keep multiplying the per employee productivity to arrive at the GDP of the services sector, which is the largest sector of the economy. And this goes on for 5 years until the new employment survey comes. When this new employment survey came for 2015, it came with a delay of a year because of procedural hassles. And they found out that in the intervening period, for 5 years they had assumed employment was growing at a certain rate, but employment was not growing. Their employment survey later on showed that. And so they had to reduce their estimate of GDP coming out of services. I'm assuming that the same will happen now, because as we know, the latest employment survey has shown that in the demonetization year, employment was down to a 45-year low. You would have heard of that controversy. When they put these numbers into the GDP estimates for the last 3 years, they're bound to revise GDP estimates downwards. So this is, this is the technical challenge. There is a political challenge, which is seen in all governments, but it is slightly acute in this government. This government is very sensitive to criticism. And when they feel that a particular data release will draw criticism for them and their economic policies or other policies, they postpone its release. And we saw that in the case of the unemployment data, which they kept saying, they kept challenging its findings till the time 2019 elections happened, and the day elections were completed and results came out, the same data they released officially. So to sum up, there are two challenges. One is a genuine technical challenge in the Indian statistical system because it has not kept pace with the complexities of the Indian economy, because of the challenge of an informal sector which is so large, which we don't see in any other economy in the world, and because we have not invested enough in our statistical systems. It's not been a priority. And secondly, because of political reasons, when governments refuse to, release or even interfere to the extent it is possible to interfere in the preparation of statistics, that is a second challenge which we are seeing more in, in the current government's regime. Going forward, I don't think this can be resolved unless we hire good statisticians as the head of our statistical departments. For 8 years, the CSO, the Central Statistical Office, was headed by one of India's best statisticians, who, by the way, was also my professor in college, T.C. Anand. So after he retired, for 1 year, they did not even fill up that post. It was lying vacant. In such a phase where there was so much criticism of Indian statistics, they had kept that position vacant. And now they have in that position somebody who is not, his credentials are not well known. And so we have to get, if we want to fix the problems, we have to get the right people. And we also have to invest in better surveys, in more number of surveys, in a larger statistical, robust statistical data gathering apparatus.
Puja, I don't know, I think through the discussion I began to wonder if this population dividend, the change of narrative or perception for Mehra being a good thing to a problem, would you say it could have anything to do, rather than with economics, it could do with the National Citizen Register that's coming out? Because it just came to me that it could be a political build-up towards that narrative.
It could be, but I wouldn't know. Politics, I don't know so much, but I share that that fear.
Thank you.
One last opportunity. Thank you, Puja, very much for joining us today. But I get to have the last word, so a couple of lines, I think. Yesterday, I was having a discussion, not discussion, but I was reading stuff. I'm on Twitter, so I was reading stuff that other people have been writing about, how India's democracy has gone to, wherever. And one of the things you realize living, thinking about these things, whether it is the economy or democracy or something else, is that in that moment, you tend to typically view things in extremes. In the sense that, you think of what's happened in Jammu and Kashmir, Article 370, and you start thinking in one extreme, one way or the other. That it is very good, that it's terrible. You think of demonetization at that time as something fantastic and something terrible. And subsequently we realized that it is more on one side, but initially we were not in a position to judge it. So those of you who feel distressed by the previous 90 minutes of discussion on the state of India's economy, even though this is a book which covers a 10-year period, I think even now, even looking at things like, even if Parle G is not selling as many biscuits in the countryside, and that should be a cause for real concern. Even then, I think the truth is somewhere in between, and it's not as if we have reached a point like in 1991 where something needs to be done urgently. And if that happens, a crisis creates opportunities as well. So if we reach that crisis point, we can be, to some degree of certainty, be sure that the government will be forced to, take measures. And then people will say this is coming too late and so on and so forth. But the point is, the truth may be somewhere in between. That there are real opportunities, even with our population growth, even with the problems in the education sector, even with the problems in the countryside, and so on and so forth. So I think we should all end on that, moderate note, not a happy note, not a sad note. I think that helps us all.
I fully agree with what you say.